In September 1950, a U.S. Navy minesweeper sailed along the San Francisco coastline and quietly sprayed a massive cloud of bacteria over the city, and not a single resident was told. Declassified Army Chemical Corps documents and a 1977 Senate investigation would later reveal that this was just one of at least 239 secret open-air biological warfare tests conducted on unsuspecting American civilians across dozens of cities. What those documents contain is more disturbing than most people are prepared to believe. On September 20th, 1950, residents of San Francisco went about their ordinary lives, commuting to work, sending their children to school, shopping along Market Street, completely unaware that the United States military had turned their city into a living laboratory. A Navy minesweeper positioned just off the coast released a massive aerosol cloud of Serratia marcescens, a bacterium the Army had selected because it produces a distinctive red pigment, making it easy to track as it drifted through the urban environment. Over the next 6 days, the ship conducted multiple spray runs, blanketing approximately 800,000 residents in what would become the most infamous operation in the history of Army biological weapons San Francisco testing programs. The Army's own after-action report, later declassified, concluded with chilling satisfaction that San Francisco had received enough bacteria for nearly every one of its residents to inhale at least 5,000 fluorescent particles. But the Army wasn't just measuring drift patterns. They were learning how to wage biological warfare against entire cities, and the people of San Francisco were the unwitting test subjects. The program was officially designated Operation Sea Spray, and its stated purpose, according to declassified Army Chemical Corps planning documents, was to study the offensive possibilities of attacking a seaport city with a biological warfare aerosol attack. The Army wanted to know how vulnerable American cities were to a Soviet biological strike, and rather than simulate the attack with harmless tracers alone, they chose to use live bacteria on a real, populated city without any public notification, consent, or subsequent medical monitoring. The declassified biological weapons program files show that military planners considered Serratia marcescens to be a harmless simulant, a convenient assumption that allowed them to bypass any ethical review that might have slowed the program. What makes Operation Sea Spray so historically significant is not just what was done, but how systematically it was concealed, buried in classified files for nearly 3 decades before a series of unexpected events forced it into the light. And those events began with something the Army never anticipated. People started getting seriously ill. In the weeks following the spraying, doctors at Stanford University Hospital recorded a dramatic and unprecedented spike in urinary tract infections caused by Serratia marcescens, a bacterium that had rarely, if ever, appeared in their patient population before. 11 patients were admitted with severe infections, and one of them, a retired pipefitter named Edward Nevin, developed complications that led to his death on November 1st, 1950. At the time, the physicians published a puzzled paper in a medical journal documenting the mysterious outbreak, unable to explain how so many patients had simultaneously contracted the same rare infection. They had no way of knowing that the United States Army had blanketed their city in that exact bacterium, just weeks earlier. Decades later, Edward Nevin's grandson would file a landmark lawsuit against the federal government, but the court's ruling in that case would reveal just how far the legal system was willing to go to protect the military's biological warfare tests on U.S. cities from accountability. The full scope of the government's experiments on citizens didn't emerge until 1977, when the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research, chaired by Senator Edward Kennedy, held hearings that forced the Army to declassify details of its Cold War-era biological testing programs. What the Army reluctantly disclosed was staggering. Operation Sea Spray was not an isolated incident, but part of a vast, decades-long campaign that included at least 239 open-air tests conducted in populated areas across the country between 1949 and 1969. New York City's subway system had been covertly sprayed with bacteria in 1966 to simulate how a biological agent would spread through underground transit networks. Light bulbs filled with Bacillus subtilis were dropped onto tracks and shattered by passing trains, distributing the aerosol to over 1 million commuters. The Army also tested over cities, including St. Louis, Minneapolis, and Corpus Christi, and along stretches of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. The Senate investigation records painted a portrait of a military establishment that had treated its own civilian population as expendable test subjects in the name of Cold War preparedness, operating with virtually no oversight and absolute secrecy. But even after the Senate hearings, the full truth about the health consequences remained, and to a significant extent still remains, deliberately obscured. In 1981, Edward Nevin's family took their case to federal court, arguing that the Army's secret spraying of San Francisco had directly caused his death, and that the government had a duty to warn civilians of the risks. The judge, however, ruled in the government's favor, invoking the discretionary function exception, essentially holding that military decisions about how to conduct national defense programs, even secret biological warfare simulations over civilian cities, were protected from legal liability. The ruling sent a chilling message. The government could expose its own citizens to biological agents, conceal the evidence for decades, and face no legal consequences. To this day, independent researchers and journalists have argued that the full catalog of government experiments on citizens during the Cold War has never been completely declassified. Internal Army documents reference additional programs and test sites whose details remain redacted or classified, and veterans groups have pressed for further disclosures about personnel who handled the biological agents. The story of Operation Sea Spray is not simply a relic of Cold War paranoia. It is a documented, evidence-led case study in what happens when military secrecy operates without democratic oversight, and a reminder that the most unsettling conspiracies are sometimes the ones that have already been confirmed by the government's own records. If this story disturbed you, subscribe and hit the bell, because next week we're covering another declassified program where the government tested on its own people, and the details are even harder to believe. You won't want to miss it.